In this video, I'm going to riff off of Chapter 6 of The Year of Dreaming Dangerously by Slavoj Zizek. It's entitled The Arab Winter, Spring, Summer, and Fall. The chapter is about the 2011 Arab Spring movements that spread over the Middle East, starting in Tunisia. And this chapter made me think more generally about how revolutions tend to get hijacked either sooner or later. What Zizek is trying to get us to do is to recognize the emancipatory potential of movements like the Arab Spring that seem to be retrograde because they don't go along entirely with the Western version of safe democratic revolution. And that would be because there's this binary in the minds of people in Western democracies of secular democracy versus theocracy, Islamic fundamentalism, etc. And in particular, Zizek hones in on the blame that goes to the left-leaning. When he uses liberal in this chapter, he's meaning left-leaning people, left-leaning moderates, as well as more left than that, true leftists, he blames for coming at the events of the Arab Spring through this binary, this lens of either secular or theocratic, religious, etc., and therefore suspect. And so they did not rise to the occasion, whether they were in those countries or whether they were in the West. They didn't rise to the occasion of embracing those movements for what he sees them to be, genuinely popular movements for emancipation that got derailed because of a lack of organization and a lack of, in this case, external support. Well, I'm sure I'm not alone in being somewhat dubious about whether external support of any revolution is a good idea, since it never seems to work either. But I do get the point. Well, and as we know, the Arab Spring started out with true revolutionary potential. Everybody saw it. I remember the press being really kind of very positive about it at first. It kind of came out of nowhere. Truly, like a lot of these things do. It kind of reminded me also of the revolution against Soviet communism that happened in the very late 80s and early 90s, in that it seemed to be spontaneous. In the case of the Arab Spring, social media had a lot to do with quick communication of what was going on, and so, as people caught wind of it, the movement spread to other countries. Well, we've already seen Zizek blame right-wing populism on the failure of liberals to provide an adequate alternative or to see the popular democratic emancipatory potential hidden within those movements and kind of warped in those movements. And that's the same maneuver he's doing here with so-called Islamofascism. And he uses that term. And he mentions it here, straight up fascism. He says, the rise of fascism is the result of the left's failure, but simultaneously proves that there was a revolutionary potential, a dissatisfaction, which the left was not able to mobilize. And the same holds for today's so-called Islamofascism, the rise of which has been exactly correlated to the disappearance of the secular left in Muslim countries. And it's true, there was a secular left in Muslim countries, not that there isn't any at all now, but there used to be a vocal secular left, as well as a left wing that attempted to read Islam from that perspective. But because that left existed during the Cold War, the West was not particularly interested in promoting it or encouraging it, and eventually it got drowned out by Islamic fundamentalism. If you want to know more about that, just Google Islamic modernism or Islam and modernism. Just as Christianity can be read both in the right-leaning direction or the left-leaning and even secular direction. The same thing holds for Islam. So I'm sure that's what Zizek is thinking of. And he says, but do not the recent vicissitudes of Muslim fundamentalism confirm Walter Benjamin's old insight that every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed revolution? Walter Benjamin was a German philosopher who died in 1940 after he'd fled from Nazi Germany. Harvard University Press has published the Arcades Project and a multi-volume selected writing set for Benjamin. If you haven't read anything about Walter Benjamin, maybe you should, although I think some of you probably already have. So the lesson that Zizek wants us to learn is that the moderate liberal forces in the Middle East and in Western democracy should stop ignoring the radical left, because if they do, they will simply be inviting a fundamentalist tide. That is, if they continue to ignore the radical left or fear it, they will be inviting a right-wing or reactionary movement instead. So far I follow him, and I think it is important to see within right-wing, fundamentalist, and sort of neo-fascist or ethno-nationalist, all that stuff, all those kinds of movements, a disgruntled popular movements that are pushing back against elites, whether they quite conceptualize it or not. And you know, this is why we're seeing more and more the radical left ideas at least being discussed with more seriousness than they have been in a long time. But the question I want to ask is, what lies beyond rebellion or revolution? Because one thing I've noticed as a political theorist is that many thinkers have been very good at telling us what's wrong, and all of that is very needed. You have to know what is wrong before you can do anything about it. And what is wrong has a lot of dimensions, and to fully understand it would take more than a lifetime. But it's very important, and there are many political thinkers who show us dimensions of what is wrong, and we definitely need them. But there are very few who actually go on to give us a clear idea of what ought to replace, what is wrong. I think in this regard, right-wingers have made a little bit more progress over the left wing. And for somebody like Zizek, that should be alarming. Probably is. I think he knows it. You know, the new right does have thinkers within it who have begun to dream up futures that involve more national independence, that involve ethnic solidarity, that involve a different kind of economics, national separatism, and so on. So they are thinking futuristically, let's say. But the left wing, kind of knocked back by the failure of communism, totalitarian communism, have been knocked so far back that you don't see that kind of confidence and you don't see that kind of dreaming, because in effect the dreaming, and remember the book is The Year of Dreaming Dangerously, well, that kind of dreaming doesn't go on very much in the left anymore, though it used to. But because of the failures, people have become very disenchanted with that, and I guess, more or less they are adrift. So leftists and just moderate Democrats had better start thinking about what life might be like on the other side, especially those involved in discussions about rebellion. Because if there's one thing we know, it's that revolutions without a well mapped out plan for what comes next get hijacked, and that's exactly what Zizek describes in this chapter. We all know, the Arab Spring started out seemingly very positive, look like some dictator governments, oppressive governments were going to be toppled, but then Islamic fundamentalists and reactionaries stepped in. Personally, I think we have enough evidence just from all of our history that we've accumulated that that we had better have some sort of procedural rules for participation in that future. In other words, for leftists who think that we will all be able to finally get along when we remove the oppressive government or the capitalist system from the framework, and we'll be able to get along without any sort of rules or pre-existing concept of order, they're probably wrong. So it bears more thought about what that should look like and what the rules ought to be, so that any change that does take place is not yet again hijacked. There's some of the big revolutions of modern times up there. The French Revolution, hijacked by extremists who love to lop off people's heads. The Bolshevik Revolution, hijacked by people who love to lop off people's heads. Oh, okay, I'm going to repeat myself. You see my point? You know, each one of them started out as rebellion against truly oppressive authority, with egalitarian ideals, with some writings to back them up, even in the case of the French Revolution, for instance, a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And I put the American Revolution down there at the bottom with a question mark, because when you think about it, you know, the American Revolution started out kind of the same way. There wasn't too terribly much of a plan for what would happen after separating from England. And the revolution looked like it was going to fail for a while. And that's when they had the Second Constitutional Convention. And so fairly early on, you had a bunch of bright people come together and come up with a, albeit flawed, but pretty detailed constitution that was fairly well thought out and had been proposed, and literate people anyway knew and could understand the proposal. And it did involve quite a bit of attention to procedural matters, how things would work, how people would operate, what powers institutions would have. Also, it shared power with the states. The national government gained a lot of power with the Second Constitution, but the states were still very powerful in their own right at the beginning. And then over time, that has changed. And not just the states have become less independent, but really when you think about it, the American regime has already fundamentally changed. The executive branch is way, way more powerful than it was conceived to be. And this is not an argument for returning back to the old days. They had problems too. But it's to say that you see the difference there. The American Revolution has gotten very, very slowly hijacked, but relative to some of these other ones, was a success from the point of view of keeping people relatively safe and independent and prosperous. And yeah, that's not saying much relative to the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Maoist Revolution, and the Arab Spring. So I'm not giving the American Revolution high praise. I'm just saying you see the difference there. So one lesson to be learned is it should be a model for us, in the sense that if you want to make some change, you better have people who can come together and who can come up with a plan, a detailed, well thought out, approved plan for moving forward, or else your revolution gets hijacked sooner rather than later. And the price of revolution is extremely high. People will die. The economy will be horribly disrupted. So it's no small thing, and it shouldn't be talked about as though it is. Sometimes these things are needed. God forbid this should be one of those times. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows until these things actually happen. But it behooves intellectuals and thought leaders to be thinking along these lines well ahead of changes like this. And I would like to see more of that, and I would like to do more of that. I, as a political theorist, have been in the mode of analyzing for a long time, because, that's what we normally do. And as I said, political theorists are very good at critiquing, taking apart, and more or less figuring out what's gone wrong, but not as good at figuring out what needs to happen. Anyway, that's the main thought that came out of this reading of Chapter 6 in the Year of Dreaming Dangerously. See you next time. Bye.